Marion, where were your parents born and raised?
In Anniston, Alabama. I think there is an Army military camp there in Anniston now that it's been there for quite some, a few years. But it's not a well-known place, Anniston. And they were born in Weaver County,
Okay.
Alabama. I never got there to see the place, but they both were raised on farms
Okay.
in Anniston.
And about what year was that?
Well, my dad was born, both parents were born in 1897. So they lived there, my dad lived there till the early part of 1916. And he followed his sister, his older sister, to Pittsburgh because she had married and come to Pittsburgh to live. So he followed her here. And somehow he had a connection with Westinghouse Electric Company because he secured a job there and worked there for, about 3 years, I think it was. And he he went back to Alabama to get his brother, who was 16 at the time. And that was around the early part of 1916. And he begged his father to let the brother come to Pittsburgh. He said he would take care of him here because he was just a boy at 16. And they both came back to Pittsburgh and worked at the Westinghouse Electric Company. But they had a habit of, I called it furloughing, the employees from time to time. And they had nothing to do between the time they were furloughed and would be taken back on the job. And he and my dad and mother knew each other from childhood, and they corresponded with each other and became engaged. My dad here in Pittsburgh and my mother still in Anniston.
Okay.
And her parents were dead and her brothers raised her. And about a month in June, well, that would have been May of 1921, my dad was furloughed, and that was before he was to go back to Anniston and marry my mother and bring her to Pittsburgh. And her brothers refused to let her come when he called and begged them to let her come here and be married, and that would have saved him 2 fares, train fares to Pittsburgh, because it would have just been her fare coming, and they refused, so he had to go down to Alabama and bring her back to Pittsburgh. And I called it living on pocket change, because in the meantime, that was 1921, but in 1917, the Alabama Draft Board sent him a notice to come that he was drafted, so he went back to Anniston and left there to go into the Army and served in France during the latter part of 1917 and 1918. And he was sent home after the armistice was signed. And he was sent home from the service and came back to Pittsburgh. And then he and my mother, in the meantime, became engaged. So he was working again at the Westinghouse at that point, and bought a house on Susquehanna, which is right over in back of the church, our church, Bethany. And they stayed there for the rest of their lives and raised 4 children.
4 children.
And he was furloughed again from the Westinghouse and decided in anger that he would never go back, and started his own line of work, which was stoking furnaces at apartment buildings. And that kept the heat going for the people. And then he became, as a caretaker. I don't know what they called him then, but I call it a caretaker at the apartment buildings where he worked, which were several. And the apartment buildings were within walking distance of our home at Brushton. And the distance was from Brushton to Wilkinsburg, which wasn't too far, but it was if you were working after you got there. And he had to walk from building to building, and by the time he stoked furnaces for all of the buildings that he had in his care, it was time to start back at the first building again. So it kept him going. And in winter he shoveled snow and kept the places going, and in the summer he mowed the lawns and he washed walls, and he just had a regular little business. And I have a card with his business on it, his name and his business and phone number and all. Our phone number was Churchill 1424. And I think everybody in Pittsburgh knew that number. And we received calls quite often. And people coming from Alabama would come to our home, because at that time there were no hotels in Pittsburgh that serviced black people. And they would just come from the South and stay with people they knew who were already settled here until they got jobs and all. And he just knew so many people. I think I told Shirley at one point that a man he called, he opened the door one day, the bell rang, he went to the door. He said, "Fish, I haven't seen you for 20 years. And I thought, how can you remember anybody you haven't seen for 20 years? But a lot of people came like that, and they just found him and sought out people they knew in the North, and they would come and get jobs and then move on.
Do you think some of the people that came up north were from Alabama, near his hometown area?
Yes, most of them were brought up in the same area.
And they were coming up north to find work?
To find work. In Pittsburgh, most of them secured positions or jobs in the steel mills here. And it was a very big business at that time.
Right. Mm-hmm. Very good. And so you all were born and raised here?
4 children were born in that house. Well, actually, I can't count how many children were born in our house because people didn't go to the hospital for childbirth. And my mother and father would get out of their bed and let whoever was ready to go into labor have their room, and that child would be born there. And I mean, people we knew or relatives, it didn't make any difference, they would come. And my aunt, who had first moved here and that my dad came to stay with, acted as a midwife. And in fact, she delivered me. And I was named Marion after her husband's second name. His name was Wallace Marion. And they named me Marion after him.
Oh, right. Yeah, so you were born in your home.
I was born in that house, and I stayed there until I married Richard Adams.
Right, very good. Well, this is great. Thank you for sharing your family's journey up here to the north. And yeah, as many black people fled the south to come to the north to find work. One last thing I'd like to ask you is, do you wonder if your parents had never left Alabama, what would your life been like?
Well, what I know of farming, I don't think I would have liked it very much. But they seem to have had a good bit of property in Alabama. Their farm and all, they were very respected people. And my father's family, most of them moved north, except one brother that I know of who stayed in the south. And my grandfather stayed there and my grandmother until their house burned down and their barn. And I could remember them saying that all they had left in the barn was a barrel of molasses, and they grew cotton and tobacco. And my dad said when he left Alabama, he would never pick another cotton ball or handle tobacco leaves. And my mother's farm grew the same produce and products. But my dad vowed he would never go back to farming, and I thanked him. I actually thanked him. I said, thank you so much for not being on a farm. Because I thought about messing around with chickens and eggs and milking cows. And so I'm a city
much
girl.
harder type of lifestyle than you had in the North. So, well, God bless you. Thank you so much. As overt like in the South, you know, but this was high school. Little Rock 9 were high school students. And I read where when they lived, you know, when the, what was it, the Brown versus the Board of Education, then down here in Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor come talking about, can we wait 2 more years?
Yeah.
And so it was already, you know, in place. And so this is what happened with the Little Rock 9. These families got together and they said, you know, our kids are going to this high school. And so this is where all that began. But the nerve of the governor talking about, can we wait 2 more years? No, it's a lot.
That's why it's so important that we elect officials.
Absolutely.
From the president on down through Congress, all of them. If they're prejudiced, it has an effect on the whole country. I just wanted to tell about my experience with my son, because he was about 13 or 14 when the marches began in Alabama, Selma, Alabama. And he wanted to go. He was determined to go and march. And I was terrified that he was going to sneak away one day and go down there, because it was just built up in him, you know. And I was surprised that he knew as much about it as he did, because I was busy raising kids, you know. But he was in school during the 60s, from 50, I think, what was that, 54?
54.
So he was, well, he was pretty young then, but when they really started marching, he was in his early teens. And I couldn't get him to understand that the leaders of the marches were grown men who had college degrees, and that he didn't have a high school degree. And I recall at his graduation, by our last name starting with A, he was one of the first students to come up on stage and get his diploma. And he took the diploma and shook hands with the principal and all, and came to the top of the steps to descend and held his fist up and stood there, and the place went up in an uproar. And I was so embarrassed. I didn't know what to think. And people were telling me, patting me on the shoulder, you know, now mother. But I just thought that was so revolutionary at that time. And it makes me think of the football player, what was his name?
Colin Kaepernick.
Yes, who bowed on one knee. And all mothers' hearts, you know, when they see their children go out, and how those parents must have felt to release their children out in the streets with bigoted people who didn't care. They didn't care about the hurt and pain they caused.
And you're referring to the students, the Little Rock 9.
To the students, yes.
That went to that high school,
yes.
And they
now,
did
they
experience.
weren't beaten, but they were spit on and cursed at. And the one thing that impressed me during that time was a picture that they used now of a young white girl. She was a student, and the expression on her face was the cruelest expression. And for a young person in high school to look like that, and innocent black children going to school with them, classmates, future classmates. And I understand that since then, she has contacted the one young woman she came in contact with. I can't think of her name, but
That's okay.
she has contacted her and apologized for the way she acted. But her face was etched in my mind forever. And I just thought if we could see ourselves sometimes and see the expressions on our faces as we respond to different experiences, would it make any difference? And it does make a difference. Just by that one girl going to apologize, she felt terrible afterwards. But whose fault is that? Is that her parents' fault? The state's fault, the teacher's fault? Whose fault is that that type of reaction is fostered in a young person, that young?
Right.
You know, a teenager is young.
Right, right. And then that time, that was very normal. And that they encouraged each other to keep that difference, that separation, and to also instill a dislike, a hate.
Yes.
And sadly, it does trickle down to the children.
I went through school from kindergarten through 12th grade with prejudiced teachers. Not all of them were, but some of them were. In grade school, our principal was prejudiced against people because I saw his reactions towards some of the kids. He was nice to me for some reason, and but the teachers were very prejudiced.
And in your student body, there were a small amount of black students?
Just a small amount at that time in each classroom, because there were just few people living in the area, black people living in the area at that time.
What school was that, Marion?
I started elementary school in the Brushton Elementary School that was on Brushton Avenue, and later became a supermarket, and now a post office, I think. Well, it was at one time. Post office, that was a big gray stone building. I'd like to go back sometime and get all the pictures and things and show them so people will know what was there, actually there on Brushton Avenue, and what was in the area. We had all kinds of stores and things, and I have a lot of stories I could tell about things that happened to us, but we were kids coming along, and we just grew up in that. And the first experience I had of really being discriminated against was when the safety patrols, who were students who had been selected in the school to work as safety patrols, were being rewarded with a trip to the Lexington skating ring. And I'm calling names because I hope some of them are living and will remember what they did. And there were two of us, two black safety patrols in that whole school. And we were taken with the rest of the class, and not too many, to the Lexington skating rink, and we walked from our area down to on Penn Avenue, somewhere, Lexington Avenue, wherever that was. I can't even remember now where it was, and they refused to let us in. And the teacher told us to go back home. Now you go straight home. Well, I had never been that far from home alone, and the person with me hadn't either, but we walked back, you know, and retraced by ourselves. And I believe that's the only time my mother ever went up to the school to see why that was allowed. And she felt that all of the students should have come back to the school. And I think the teacher was very embarrassed because she just sputtered around, you know, but she just told us for our safety to go straight back the way we came. We just came. We could have gotten lost on the way because I didn't know the area, you know. but that was the first experience I had with being discriminated against. And it hurt, you know.
Absolutely.
But then afterwards I got angry, and I'm still angry. It's something that lives with you. And to think that you're different all your life, you know.
Right.
But my parents protected us from a very, what can I say, a very forceful, discriminatory life. They told us whatever was, they made it sound good, like we weren't allowed to eat in restaurants. They said, well, home cooking is superior to restaurant cuisine. We'll eat at home. We weren't allowed to swim in the city pools, Highland Park.
Right.
We could go to the zoo in Highland Park, which we did often. We went swimming in creeks. One place was Willow Beach, and I was very young, and I don't know where that was, but my dad got in his little 25 coupe and piled us all in there, and we would go swimming. And he said, this is more freedom than being in that fenced-in pool. And we thought we were doing something that was an excellent choice, you know.
Right. And more fun and exciting.
And it was fun. We enjoyed life. But we were discriminated against, but we didn't realize it. But maybe I was just dumb like I am now.
Well, you know, it just, you know, as a tribute to your parents for diverting that type of hate. And that made it a positive experience, because they knew that the damage as a young person, as you mentioned about the woman that eventually apologized to that young woman, but all of those years that young woman experienced hurt and pain.
Yes.
You know, it could only be erased just in a small way. For that woman, she did it because it was on her conscience.
Yes. And have you heard that the woman who accused Emmett Till, who was murdered in Mississippi, I think, admitted that she lied and has tried to apologize? But how can she live with herself? But how can the people who crucified Christ live with themselves? You know?
It's just human nature. It's part of the way the world is, sadly.
Yep.
Yeah.
It is sad.
Yeah.
And it's something that we've all dealt with from one time or another, you know.
Yeah.
But because of Jesus, we made it through.
Amen. That's right.